What was hygiene like in the Victorian era? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the 19th century. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's wander together into an era that people like to call elegant, industrial, and respectable. But, as with most things, the surface was much shinier than what was actually happening underneath. Because tonight, we're talking about hygiene in the Victorian world. And yes, already, you can sense where this is going. Now, when you think of the Victorians, you might picture polished boots, elaborate dresses with layers of lace, gentlemen in top hats, and streets bustling with horse-drawn carriages. But beneath that carefully stitched exterior, life was considerably less fragrant. The Victorians did many things in excess, mourning, moralizing, and inventing strange devices with brass fittings, but washing themselves thoroughly was not exactly a national priority. That doesn't mean they were completely oblivious. People did bathe. Sometimes. They did clean their homes. Sort of. They certainly had soap. But compared to our modern expectations, it all feels quaint. Or perhaps horrifying, depending on your tolerance for grime. Let's begin gently with the subject of bathing. Bathing, in the Victorian imagination, was both a necessity and a moral decision. Many believed that keeping your body clean was linked to keeping your soul pure, because of course they did. But the actual logistics of this moral bathing were, shall we say, inconsistent. Public baths existed, especially in large cities, but they were not exactly luxurious. You could pay a small fee for access to a tub, and the water was often lukewarm, sometimes reused. Yes, reused. Imagine slipping into water that's already hosted a dozen strangers, each bringing their own contribution of sweat, soot, and industrial dust. Refreshing. In private homes, the situation varied widely. Wealthier families might have proper bathrooms by the late 19th century, complete with running water. But early on, and for most people, bathing was a rare event. You had a tin tub, you heated water on the stove, and you made do. In smaller households, the whole family often took turns in the same water. Parents first, then the children in descending order of age, with the youngest usually receiving the murkiest experience of all. Economical, yes. Hygienic, less so. And then there was the obsession with cold water. Some reformers believed that hot baths weakened the body and encouraged indulgence, while icy plunges were invigorating and virtuous. Naturally, these same reformers rarely had to do this themselves, they simply recommended it enthusiastically for the working classes. Soap was, in theory, available. But early Victorian soap was harsh, expensive, and not always pleasant smelling. Homemade lye soap was popular in rural areas, which left you clean in the sense that it stripped oils from your skin, and also possibly removed a few layers of skin along the way. A refreshing burn to remind you that you're still alive. Let's drift now to hair. Victorian hair care was elaborate, but cleanliness was not its strong suit. Washing hair with water and soap was seen as dangerous, it might cause illness, or worse, damage the hair's glossy appearance. Instead, people relied on dry shampoos made of starch or even powders containing lead. Because nothing says healthy hair like mild poisoning. Ladies often oiled their hair to keep it sleek, sometimes so heavily that dust and soot clung to it, forming a sort of sticky halo. Think of it as an early form of urban camouflage. Gentlemen had pomade, which left their hair shiny, stiff, and smelling faintly of rancid bear grease. Yes, bear grease was a popular ingredient. Nothing more dignified than strolling down the boulevard smelling faintly of zoo. And of course, we must speak of teeth. Dental hygiene was a negotiation. Toothbrushes did exist. The early ones were often made with bone handles and bristles of hog hair. If you were lucky, the bristles stayed in place; if not, you ended up swallowing a few, which was considered character building. Tooth powders were common, and while some contained chalk or crushed seashells, others helpfully included things like brick dust or charcoal. Great for that polished look. Less great for long-term dental health. Dentistry itself was still developing. If your tooth hurt, the simplest solution was to pull it out. Anesthetic was available in the later part of the century, but before that, it was more a test of endurance than a medical procedure. Now, hygiene isn't just about bathing and brushing. It's also about the broader environment, streets, homes, and the air people breathed. And here, the Victorians truly outdid themselves. Let's wander through a Victorian city. The streets were crowded, muddy, and filled with horse manure. By the mid-century, London alone had hundreds of thousands of horses, each contributing several pounds of waste daily. This was not efficiently cleared away. It piled up, attracting flies, mixing with rain, and forming a slurry that coated shoes and skirts alike. Add to this the charming aroma of human waste. Indoor plumbing was far from universal. Many households relied on chamber pots, which were emptied, sometimes carefully, often not, into cesspits or simply flung into the street with a cheerful cry of Gardyloo. If you were unlucky enough to be passing by, well, you learned to walk close to the wall. Sewage systems were an ongoing disaster. London's famously backed up into the Thames, leading to the Great Stink of 1858. The heat that summer intensified the river's already powerful odor to the point where Parliament considered evacuating. They didn't, of course. They simply soaked the curtains in chloride of lime and soldiered on. Which is one way to deal with a national crisis. Water supply was no better. Many households drew their water directly from rivers or wells that were conveniently located near cesspits. Outbreaks of cholera were frequent, but at the time, people blamed them on miasma, bad air, rather than contaminated water. It took the persistence of Dr. John Snow, mapping cholera cases around a single pump in Soho, to show otherwise. His discovery was revolutionary, but it also meant admitting that everyone had been drinking water laced with sewage for decades. A comforting bedtime thought. Inside the home, cleanliness was variable. Middle-class Victorians prized tidiness and polished surfaces, but actual sanitation was trickier. Coal fires coated every surface with soot. Windows were rarely open, since fresh air was considered suspicious. Rooms were often heavy with dust, fabric, and lingering smoke. And in the background, there was always the faint rustle of bedbugs, fleas, and lice, who found Victorian households perfectly welcoming. Clothing hygiene was equally complicated. Washing machines were a late-century innovation, so laundering meant hours of boiling, scrubbing, and wringing. Whites were bleached in sunlight or with harsh chemicals. Colored fabrics were rarely washed at all, just brushed, sponged, or beaten with sticks. Outer garments, like heavy dresses and coats, could go months without anything resembling a wash. This, naturally, helped disguise the fact that their wearers also bathed infrequently. Perfume became both a luxury and a practical tool. Scents were used to cover the more aggressive odors of daily life. Lavenders, roses, and citrus oils floated through parlors, mingling with the unmistakable background notes of coal smoke, damp wool, and unwashed humanity. For those of higher status, a carefully chosen scent was the difference between elegance and suspicion. And yet, for all these shortcomings, the Victorians were also deeply anxious about cleanliness. They associated dirt with disease, but they didn't always know which dirt mattered. Soap advertisements proliferated, promising purity, health, and even moral uplift. Cleanliness campaigns urged the working classes to scrub harder, though often without giving them the means to actually do so. Reformers preached, factories polluted, and ordinary families carried on with their tin tubs, their hog-bristle toothbrushes, and their lavender water. It's tempting to laugh at the Victorians for their fragrant chaos, and certainly, there's humor in imagining powdered hair clumped with coal dust or gentlemen shimmering with bare grease. But it's also worth remembering that they were improvising in a rapidly changing world. Cities had exploded in size. Technology was outpacing infrastructure. Germ theory was still a newcomer, and many clung to older, less accurate ideas. So, while we might recoil at the thought of reused bathwater or brick dust toothpaste, they were, most of them, doing their best. Even if their best occasionally meant dousing the curtains with lime and hoping for the breeze to shift. And with that, let's drift gently away from soap, soot, and sewage, and into the next corner of history's oddities, where royal families were doing their usual job of making everything worse. The most inbred monarchs in European history. So, let's leave behind the soap shortages and chamber pots of the Victorian world. Tonight we're floating further back, and sideways, into the halls of Europe's royal palaces. Because while the Victorians were fumbling around with toothbrushes made of pig bristles, royal dynasties across Europe were busy with their own experiment. A rather unromantic one. It was called keeping the bloodline pure. That sounds dramatic. But in practice, it mostly meant marrying your cousin. Over and over. Sometimes your niece. Occasionally your aunt. Because why go through the trouble of meeting strangers, when you can simply recycle the family you already have? This obsession with dynastic purity gave us some of the most fragile, unfortunate monarchs history has ever seen. And tonight, in the calm glow of the bedtime hour, we're going to drift among them. Let's begin with perhaps the most infamous figure in this particular gallery, Charles II of Spain. Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. And if you've ever wondered how many generations of intermarriage it takes before a royal family essentially collapses, Charles is your answer. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a wreath. Over 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs married within the dynasty so relentlessly that Charles ended up with an inbreeding coefficient of over 25%. For perspective, that's about the same as the child of a brother and sister. Not cousins. Siblings. The results were, unsurprisingly, not great. Charles was sickly from birth. He had what contemporaries called the Habsburg jaw, a protruding, elongated chin so exaggerated that he could barely chew food. His tongue was unusually large, making speech difficult. His body was frail, his legs weak, and his intelligence, well, let's just say that no one was confusing him with a scholar. One ambassador politely described him as imbecilic. Another less politely called him a human caricature. Charles was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. People genuinely believed he was cursed. But the truth was less mystical. It was simply centuries of bad marriage strategy. He was married twice, but left no children. He died in 1700, aged just 38, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which dragged most of Europe into conflict for over a decade. All because no one in his family could bear to marry outside the clan. Now, Charles was extreme. But he wasn't alone. The Habsburgs as a whole were notorious for their insularity. Their motto was said to be, "Let others wage wars, you, fortunate Austria, marry." Which sounds elegant, until you realize they meant marry each other. Take Philip II of Spain, for example, Charles II's great-grandfather. Philip married 4 times. 2 of his wives were his nieces. Because of course they were. He fathered 13 children, but many died young, and several were sickly. This wasn't unusual. Infant mortality among royals was high, not only because of disease, but because their genetic dice were being rolled with fewer and fewer numbers. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs. The Bourbon dynasty in France and Spain also indulged in plenty of cousin marriage. By the 18th century, royal families across Europe were practically one extended family reunion that never ended. This created what some historians call royal monoculture. Imagine a garden where every plant is grown from the same cuttings. At first, it looks uniform, elegant. But then disease strikes, and suddenly everything withers. The same thing happened with monarchs. Weak immune systems. Fragile bones. Mysterious illnesses that baffled doctors. And into this frailty was often added a sense of divine importance. You may be half crippled by gout and epilepsy, but you are still anointed by God. Which, naturally, made it worse. Let's drift now to King George III of Britain. George is remembered as the king who went mad, and as the monarch on the other end of the American Revolution. His illness has been debated for centuries. Some suggest porphyria, a genetic disorder affecting the blood. Others say it was bipolar disorder. Either way, it caused episodes of mania, confusion, and disorientation. He once spoke for hours without stopping, and sometimes wandered the palace gardens talking to trees. Was this connected to inbreeding? Possibly. The Hanoverians weren't quite as intensely intermarried as the Habsburgs, but they were hardly adventurous either. George's parents were cousins. His wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was a relatively distant relation, but still part of the same closed aristocratic pool. the constant recycling of relatives certainly didn't help the genetic stability of the dynasty. And then there's the tragic case of Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. He was the youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Leopold inherited hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Even small injuries could be fatal. The disease ran through Victoria's descendants like an invisible thread, showing up in royal families across Europe. Hemophilia is a genetic condition carried by women and expressed in men. Where did it come from? Most likely, it was a spontaneous mutation in Queen Victoria herself. But once in the family, it spread quickly, because royals kept marrying their cousins. And so hemophilia appeared in the Romanovs of Russia, in the Spanish Bourbons, and in Germany. Leopold himself died at 30 after a minor fall. His nephew, Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, also had hemophilia, which became a key factor in the downfall of the Romanovs. His illness made the family desperate for cures, which led them into the orbit of the mystic Rasputin. And we all know how that turned out. So yes, one genetic condition, multiplied by dynastic inbreeding, contributed to the collapse of empires. Another memorable figure in this gallery of fragile royals is King Charles VI of France. Charles ruled in the late 14th century. He began his reign energetically, but around age 25, he suffered a sudden mental breakdown. He became prone to psychotic episodes, delusions, and violent outbursts. At one point, he believed he was made of glass, and took care not to shatter. He also occasionally failed to recognize his wife and children. Now, mental illness isn't exclusively caused by inbreeding, of course. But the French Valois dynasty was entangled with the same tangled web of cousin marriages as the rest of Europe. Charles's instability contributed to the chaos of the 100 Years' War, and to a French monarchy so riddled with fragility that it stumbled into disaster repeatedly. Let's pause here and notice something. Inbreeding among monarchs wasn't just about vanity, or even pure snobbery. It was strategy. Royals believed that marrying outsiders risked weakening claims to the throne. A cousin, however, came pre-approved. Same dynasty, same legitimacy. The genetic risks weren't understood, or were simply ignored. Dynasties preferred certainty in the short term, even if it meant disaster in the long run. The irony is that while peasants often lived healthier, sturdier lives, marrying unrelated partners from nearby villages, their monarchs were collapsing under the weight of too much family loyalty. We can't talk about this subject without drifting to the Romanovs of Russia. By the 19th century, the Russian imperial family was thoroughly entangled with the rest of Europe's royals. Queen Victoria was nicknamed the grandmother of Europe because her children and grandchildren married into nearly every major dynasty. The result? The same genes looping endlessly through the same gilded halls. Tsar Nicholas II's only son, Alexei, inherited hemophilia from Victoria's line. His illness left him weak and often near death. The desperation to protect him gave Rasputin his foothold in the palace. The Tsarina, Alexandra, believed the mystic's prayers could heal her son. And while Rasputin may have been many things, eccentric, manipulative, fond of midnight parties, he was not a doctor. His influence eroded trust in the monarchy, at precisely the moment Russia was heading toward revolution. So again, one genetic disorder, nurtured by a century of intermarriage, helped push an empire off a cliff. By now, you may be wondering, did no one notice? The answer is, they did. There were occasional voices warning against constant cousin marriage. But tradition and politics were stubborn. It was easier to keep recycling familiar relatives than to risk scandal by marrying a commoner. And besides, the system had worked, more or less, for centuries. It wasn't until monarchs started producing heirs who were too ill, too deformed, or too incapable to rule that the consequences became impossible to ignore. Even then, the solution wasn't immediate. Charles II of Spain died in 1700, but cousin marriages continued well into the 19th century. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits are gilded with divine right and stitched with ermine. So, what do we make of all this? Europe's most inbred monarchs weren't simply unlucky. They were the inevitable product of a system that valued dynastic purity over biological reality. Their illnesses and weaknesses shaped wars, toppled empires, and altered history. But in their own time, they were often pitted, or even revered, as tragic victims of fate. Few people blame the real culprit, centuries of recycling the same family tree. It's almost poetic. The very families that demanded purity and superiority ended up undone by their own insistence on staying inside the family circle. And so, as we drift to the close of this part, picture Charles II of Spain, sitting weakly on his throne, jaw jutting, eyes heavy, body frail. A monarch not bewitched, but simply the final, faltering echo of a dynasty that refused to look beyond itself. Let's float onward, then, into the next sleepy corner of history, where royalty continues to demonstrate just how fragile, petty, and gloriously dysfunctional power can be. Sickly, spoiled, and sad, medieval royal childhoods. So far tonight, we've waded through Victorian hygiene, and tiptoed among Europe's most inbred monarchs. Now, let's soften the focus and wander backward a little further. Because if there's one thing medieval history proves, it's that royal childhood was rarely the dream we imagine. It was, more often, a carefully staged disaster. When you picture a medieval prince or princess, maybe you see velvet robes, golden crowns that are slightly too big for their heads, and minstrels playing lullabies in candlelit halls. In reality, their lives were usually defined by illness, strict control, endless expectations, and, of course, a healthy dose of bizarre parenting decisions. Let's drift through a few of these childhoods, each one strange in its own way. We'll begin with Edward VI of England. Edward was the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, which meant he arrived in the world carrying a weight that was frankly absurd for a newborn. His birth in 1537 was treated like the Second Coming. Finally, Henry had his long-awaited male heir. The problem? Edward was fragile. Extremely fragile. He was often ill, pale, and undersized. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent, yes, but prone to fevers and coughs. His tutors kept him swaddled in lessons, pushing Latin, Greek, and theology into his small head, while his body struggled to keep up. And in typical tutor fashion, he was never allowed to forget that he was more symbol than child. His very existence was supposed to prove Henry's controversial marriage to Jane Seymour was divinely ordained. Imagine being 10 years old and already responsible for the legitimacy of the English Reformation. Edward became king at just 9 years old. He reigned for 6 years, during which his protectors and advisors did all the actual ruling. His health, meanwhile, deteriorated steadily. He died of tuberculosis at 15, coughing out what was left of his short, chilly life. A boy raised to be the savior of England, who barely lived long enough to grow a proper beard. Now, Edward's story is tragic, but at least he made it into his teens. Many royal children didn't. Take Eleanor of Brittany. She was the daughter of Geoffrey, who was one of the younger brothers of Richard the Lionheart and King John. By a quirk of dynastic chance, Eleanor had a decent claim to the English throne, which, naturally, made her life miserable. Instead of enjoying a normal childhood, Eleanor spent most of her existence as a political prisoner. From age 15 onward, she was locked away, moved from castle to castle, always under guard, never allowed to marry, and never given freedom. All because the English crown couldn't risk her being used by rivals as a figurehead. So imagine, one day you're a bright young princess. The next, you're effectively a child hostage to your own family's paranoia. Eleanor spent nearly 40 years in confinement. Her childhood wasn't just spoiled, it never really ended. She remained the perpetual princess in the tower, slowly fading from memory. And speaking of fading from memory, let's drift toward the infamous story of the princes in the tower. Edward V of England and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were only 12 and 9 when they were lodged in the Tower of London in 1483. Officially, this was for their protection. In reality, their uncle Richard, soon to become Richard III, was preparing to seize the throne. The boys disappeared that summer. No definitive record tells us what happened. Some say they were quietly murdered, smothered in their sleep. Others claim they lived on in obscurity. But what's clear is that their short lives ended in confinement, uncertainty, and probably betrayal. Not exactly the kind of childhood memory one hopes to pass down. Their story became one of England's most enduring tragedies, royal children transformed into pale symbols of innocence lost. And again, their childhoods were less about growing up, and more about being pawns in someone else's political game. But childhood misery wasn't always political. Sometimes it was just parental. Consider Louis XIII of France. He grew up in the shadow of his father, Henry IV, and his mother, Marie de Medici. His early years were shaped by court intrigue, bitter arguments, and more assassination attempts than any toddler should really have to endure. His father was stabbed to death when Louis was 8. His mother then acted as regent, showering power and favor on her Italian relatives while treating Louis like a decorative afterthought. The result? Louis grew up shy, anxious, and emotionally starved. He was bullied by servants, manipulated by courtiers, and awkward in every social situation. He eventually became king, but he remained withdrawn, deeply dependent on advisors like Cardinal Richelieu. His childhood had essentially hollowed him out. He was the monarch equivalent of a fragile porcelain doll, nice to look at, but in constant danger of shattering. Another sad example comes from the Holy Roman Empire, Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. Wenceslas was crowned king of Bohemia at age 2, which, even by medieval standards, is excessive. His father, Charles IV, adored him, but in the suffocating way of a parent who believes his child is destined to embody every virtue in Christendom. Wenceslas was spoiled rotten, but without stability. He grew up indulged, pampered, and entirely unprepared for ruling. By adulthood, he was lazy, indecisive, and prone to drink. He spent much of his reign hunting and feasting, while the empire fractured around him. His childhood had given him endless privilege, and none of the discipline to use it well. The lesson seems to be that you can smother a child with both silk and expectations, and still end up with a king who'd rather nap than govern. And then there's the strange, pitiful case of King John of France, nicknamed the Posthumous. John was born in 1316, the son of Louis X. His father had died 5 months earlier, leaving the unborn child as his only heir. When John finally arrived, the entire kingdom waited breathlessly to see if he was a boy, because only a boy could inherit. He was. But tragically, John lived just 5 days. He was crowned at birth, reigned in the cradle, and died before he could even see the world beyond his nurse's arms. Few royal childhoods were sadder, or shorter. His entire existence was basically one long political crisis, swaddled in linen. And while we're on the subject of short-lived children, we can't forget the countless royal babies who were treated as dynastic investments rather than actual humans. Many were married off before they could walk. Betrothals were made for toddlers, binding them to foreign courts before they even knew what a crown was. Childhood was less about playing with wooden toys, and more about being a pawn on the chessboard of Europe. Take Margaret Beaufort. She was married at age 12, gave birth at 13, and nearly died in the process. Her only child, Henry Tudor, eventually became Henry VII of England. Margaret herself spent the rest of her life cloaked in piety, perhaps partly because her childhood had been stripped so completely of innocence. And yet, sometimes the problem wasn't loss of innocence, but its opposite. Some royal children were kept so sheltered, so carefully groomed, that they emerged into adulthood with the emotional maturity of a spoiled puppy. Consider Henry VI of England. Crowned as an infant, Henry grew up in a world where every need was met, but every decision was made for him. He was gentle, kind, and pious, but utterly unfit for the brutal politics of 15th century England. When adulthood arrived, he collapsed under the strain, suffering episodes of mental breakdown that left him vacant for months at a time. His childhood had made him pure, yes, but also fragile, naive, and doomed. So what ties all these stories together? Royal childhoods in the Middle Ages were rarely about childhood at all. They were about preparing symbols, heirs, and bargaining chips. Princes and princesses were treated like little adults, burdened with dynastic responsibility before they could even read. If they were sickly, they were pitted but still pushed forward as pawns. If they were strong, they were married off like horses at a market. And if they were unlucky, they spent their short lives in confinement, or under the shadow of plots, or simply collapsing under the weight of expectation. It's strange to think that peasants' children, poor, overworked, often hungry, sometimes had freer childhoods than the sons and daughters of kings. They could run in fields, marry for affection, live without constant surveillance. Royal children, by contrast, were swaddled in velvet but chained by politics. And so, as the candle burns low in our imaginary hall, we can see them, pale princes coughing in their tutors' rooms, princesses pacing inside tower walls, little kings crowned before they can walk, spoiled heirs who never grow into their crowns. Sickly, spoiled, and sad. The medieval world may have wrapped them in gold, but it rarely gave them the one thing every child actually needs, the chance to simply be children. The pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. We've bathed, badly, with the Victorians. We've tiptoed through the fragile web of inbred monarchs. And we've peered into the gloomy nurseries of medieval royals. Now, let's relax into something that feels almost comforting: pettiness. Because if history proves anything, it's that kings and queens, despite the crowns and velvet robes, were often just as petty, petulant, and dysfunctional as the rest of us. Only, when they had a tantrum, entire countries tended to suffer. So let's drift through a few monarchs whose reigns were defined less by statesmanship, and more by their own small grievances. We might as well begin with King James I of England. James was clever. He was well-read. He united the crowns of England and Scotland. But he also had one of the pettiest streaks in royal history. His particular obsession? Witchcraft. James firmly believed witches were conspiring to kill him. When storms disrupted his voyage to Denmark in 1589, he decided witches had raised the wind specifically to target his ship. Naturally, this was followed by a witch-hunting campaign. Dozens of people were accused, tortured, and executed. All because James couldn't imagine that sometimes the sea is just stormy. He even wrote a whole book about it, Demonology. Imagine being king of two nations and spending your free time writing witch-hunting fanfiction. But James was convinced he was protecting Christendom, while in reality, he was mostly indulging his own paranoia. Then there's Queen Christina of Sweden. Christina was brilliant, eccentric, and thoroughly uninterested in the traditional duties of queenship. She hated marriage, loved philosophy, and preferred dressing in men's clothes. All perfectly fine, except she also had a flair for dysfunction. Christina once ordered the execution of her courtier, Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie, simply because she was irritated with him. Later, she abdicated the throne entirely, converted to Catholicism, and wandered Europe, leaving a trail of unpaid debts and awkward diplomatic incidents. Her pettiness reached its peak in Rome, where she allegedly had her former lover and advisor Monaldeschi stabbed to death in front of witnesses, just to make a point. Dysfunctional? Absolutely. But also a reminder that sometimes, royal drama looked less like grand tragedy, and more like a very bloody breakup. Now, if we want pure pettiness wrapped in royal silk, we can't avoid Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Louis built Versailles, the glittering palace of endless mirrors and gardens. But Versailles wasn't just a home. It was a stage for his pettiness. Louis believed that controlling the nobility meant exhausting them with ritual. So he created endless, fussy ceremonies around his daily life. Nobles competed for the honor of handing him his shirt in the morning. Or his gloves. Or, in some cases, watching him eat. Imagine being reduced to a spectator sport for someone else's breakfast. Louis also had an extraordinary memory for slights. If a noble failed to bow correctly, or a courtier didn't flatter him enough, they could expect years of cold neglect. Versailles became a glittering cage, where grown men and women fought desperately for the chance to hold a candlestick while the king put on his slippers. Dysfunction disguised as majesty. And speaking of slipper-related dysfunction, let's glide toward Emperor Nero of Rome. Yes, I know, we're drifting outside medieval and early modern Europe here, but Nero deserves at least a drowsy mention. Nero fancied himself a great artist. He played the lyre, wrote poetry, and forced audiences to listen to his performances. Unfortunately, no one dared leave the theater while the emperor was performing. Accounts say women gave birth during his endless recitals, and men pretended to die just so they could be carried out. And when Rome burned in 64 CE, Nero's response was less about relief efforts and more about finding a dramatic angle. he allegedly sang about the fall of Troy while the city smoldered, because why not turn national catastrophe into a personal concert? This wasn't just dysfunction, it was performance art, with an empire as the unwilling audience. Back in England, let's talk about King John. John is remembered as one of the worst kings in English history. Petty doesn't even begin to cover it. He lost most of England's territory in France, quarreled with his barons, and eventually signed the Magna Carta under duress. But what really stands out are his small, vindictive habits. He fined nobles enormous sums for trivial offenses. He seized estates on flimsy excuses. He once starved the wife and son of one of his enemies to death in prison. Not exactly the behavior of a man secure in his power. Chroniclers hated him. One wrote that John hell itself is defiled by the foulness of John, which is about as petty as medieval insults get. But given his track record, it was probably fair. Now, let's drift north to Scotland, and to Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's life was full of drama, much of it beyond her control. But her personal decisions often made things worse. She married her cousin, Lord Darnley, a man described by contemporaries as vain, arrogant, and prone to drunkenness. Naturally, this went badly. Darnley alienated half the court, then helped murder Mary's secretary in front of her, during a supper party. Romantic. Mary, in turn, fell for the Earl of Bothwell, who was suspected of arranging Darnley's mysterious death. Within months of Darnley's murder, she married Bothwell, igniting scandal. The whole affair left her in prison, forced to abdicate, and eventually executed in England. Mary's tragedy was real, but it was also fueled by personal dysfunction. Bad marriages, worse timing, and a stubborn refusal to see the fire until she was already standing in it. And then there's Catherine de' Medici. Catherine was Queen of France in the 16th century, and mother to 3 kings. She was also the sort of person who would happily stage-manage chaos from behind the scenes. When her son Charles IX was struggling with power, Catherine allegedly orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, in which thousands of Protestants were slaughtered. Even if her exact role is debated, the fact remains, she was willing to turn France into a bloodbath to maintain her grip on influence. She also reportedly dabbled in astrology, poisons, and secret midnight rituals. Whether these were exaggerated by her enemies or not, Catherine leaned into the image of the sinister Queen Mother. Dysfunction elevated to high strategy. Of course, not all royal pettiness was bloody. Sometimes, it was just ridiculous. Take Queen Anne of Great Britain. Anne was plagued by ill health and endured the tragedy of 17 pregnancies, with none of her children surviving into adulthood. But alongside this sadness, she also had a spectacularly petty falling out with her longtime favorite, Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Their quarrel over court influence spiraled into full-blown public drama. Sarah accused Anne of being weak and indecisive, and retaliated by freezing Sarah out of her presence, replacing her with a new favorite. Letters were exchanged. Friendships shattered. The fate of government policy literally hinged on who the Queen preferred as her emotional confidant that week. It was, in short, high school politics, except with crowns and armies. What we see, drifting through these stories, is that kings and queens were rarely the grand, dignified figures portrayed in portraits. They were deeply human, fragile, insecure, and frequently absurd. Their pettiness could topple kingdoms. Their dysfunction could trigger massacres. Or, at the very least, ruin a few noble breakfasts. The irony is that these monarchs often believed themselves chosen by God, above ordinary mortals. Yet their reigns were shaped by the same tiny squabbles and personal quirks that shape everyone else's life. Just on a much, much larger scale. And so, as we drowse here at the edge of history, we can picture them. James I, glaring at witches in the shadows of a storm. Louis XIV, demanding applause for putting on a shirt. Mary Stuart, hopelessly entangled in yet another bad romance. Nero, forcing Rome to endure his midnight concert. Petty. Dysfunctional. And yet, profoundly human. Bread, feasts, and gladiator games. Hey everyone, settle in. Loosen your shoulders. Let the day fade out of focus. Tonight, we're drifting back to Rome. Not the solemn, marble Rome of statues and senators, but the Rome of crumbs and spectacles. The world of bread, feasts, and gladiator games. Because if there's one thing the emperors understood, it was that nothing kept the people calm like a full stomach and a bit of bloodshed in the afternoon. Let's start with the bread. The Roman grain supply was the empire's lifeline. Without it, the city of a million souls would collapse in chaos. That's why Rome's rulers spent enormous energy shipping grain from Egypt and North Africa to the Tiber docks. Ships creaked into port, loaded down with sacks of wheat. Bureaucrats tallied, weighed, and distributed it. Citizens received their rations as part of the annona, the grain dole. And because humans are humans, the lines for free bread could turn into something between a village fair and a mild riot. A bad harvest? Panic. A missing shipment? Accusations of corruption. An emperor trying to cut the supply? Suicidal. Augustus, the empire's first emperor, knew this well. He made sure the dole was generous. He even set up permanent officials to oversee it. Because nothing says I'm the legitimate ruler of Rome quite like making sure everyone has breakfast. It became such a defining feature of Roman politics that the poet Juvenal later sneered that all the people wanted was panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Food for the belly. Games for the eyes. And absolutely no interest in higher civic duty. Now, about those feasts. Roman banquets were legendary. Not always for good reasons. A proper feast involved reclining on couches, drinking watered wine, and enduring endless toasts. The wealthy prided themselves on variety and excess. Dishes of peacock, flamingo tongue, dormice stuffed with herbs and nuts. Imagine being so rich that you look at a small rodent and think, yes, that's tonight's delicacy. Of course, these feasts weren't just about food. They were about showing off. Who could host the most dazzling display? Who could afford to import oysters from Britain, figs from Syria, or snow hauled from distant mountains to chill the wine? Status was measured in exotic groceries. And the dysfunction showed. The Emperor Vitellius, for example, was infamous for his gluttony. He allegedly ate 4 enormous banquets a day. His favorite dish was something called the Shield of Minerva, a stew of fish, fowl, and animal livers, all simmered together in a giant bowl. By the time of his downfall, Vitellius was so bloated he could barely move, and his enemies gleefully mocked his diet as much as his politics. Even more restrained emperors couldn't resist theatrical dining. Elagabalus, the teenage emperor with a flair for absurdity, once served peas covered in gold leaf. Another time, he reportedly invited guests to a feast where every dish was made of beans. The joke wore thin quickly, but Elagabalus was delighted. He also enjoyed releasing leopards and bears into banquet halls, because nothing says dinner party quite like fending off a wild cat between courses. But for the masses, the real entertainment wasn't the banquets of the rich. It was the games. The Colosseum, officially the Flavian Amphitheater, was Rome's cathedral of spectacle. Tens of thousands packed its tiers, from senators in marble seats to plebeians sweating in the sun at the top. The crowd came for the thrill of combat. The clash of sword and shield. The roar of wild beasts. And the knowledge that, for one afternoon, someone else's misery was their amusement. Gladiators were often slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. They trained in special schools, drilled endlessly, and were thrown into the arena as living entertainment. Some became celebrities. Fans painted graffiti of their favorite fighters. Women swooned over their muscles and scars. Merchants sold souvenirs. And yet, as glamorous as the arena might seem in hindsight, the reality was brutal. Battles could end in death, though not always. After all, training gladiators was expensive. Sometimes, the contests were carefully choreographed. Sometimes, they were desperate struggles for survival. The crowd decided fates with a wave of the hand, spare him or kill him. Then there were the wild beast hunts. Lions, tigers, elephants, all shipped from across the empire to be slaughtered in the arena. At one festival under Titus, thousands of animals were killed in a single day. The spectacle was meant to demonstrate Rome's domination of nature itself. though from the modern perspective, it looks more like ecological devastation as public theater. And because emperors loved nothing more than excess, some games went far beyond combat. Under Emperor Titus, the Colosseum was once flooded to stage mock naval battles. Tiny ships clashed on artificial lakes, rowed by prisoners who fought until they sank. The logistics were insane. Drainage systems, water channels, massive engineering, all for a few hours of watery carnage. Domitian, not to be outdone, staged nighttime games by torchlight, so the crowd could enjoy executions after dark. Elagabalus, yes, him again, thought it would be funny to release harmless animals, like deer or rabbits, into the arena and watch the crowd scramble after them. Dysfunction disguised as generosity. Of course, all of this wasn't just for fun. It was politics. The games were how emperors bought loyalty, distracted the restless, reminded everyone who controlled the grain, the beasts, the swords. When an emperor appeared in the Colosseum, he was more than a ruler. He was a living god of spectacle. His thumbs determined life and death. His generosity determined how many feasts or games the people enjoyed that year. It's no accident that unpopular emperors often doubled down on shows. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, fancied himself a gladiator. He entered the arena personally, fighting with blunted weapons against terrified opponents who dared not touch him. To the crowd, it was absurd, your emperor in a loincloth, sweating under the sun, pretending to be Hercules. But Commodus loved it. And he banked on the games keeping him popular, even as the empire rotted around him. What's striking, drifting through these stories, is how human it all feels. Yes, Rome was the greatest empire of its age. Yes, its emperors built aqueducts, conquered territories, and passed laws. But what most people remembered was the bread they ate, the feasts they envied, the games they cheered. For the poor citizen, life meant queuing for grain, squinting up at the gladiators, gossiping about which emperor was the fattest, the weirdest, or the cruelest. For the rich, life meant reclining on couches, pretending to enjoy flamingo, and silently hoping the emperor didn't release a bear during dessert. And through it all, the empire churned forward, its politics greased by wheat shipments, its culture bound by the glue of spectacle. So tonight, as we let the Colosseum fade into shadow, we can imagine it. The smell of bread drifting from the bakeries. The clatter of dishes in a crowded feast. The roar of the crowd as a gladiator raises his sword to the sky. Bread. Feasts. Games. The ordinary hungers of Rome, served with extraordinary dysfunction. Exotic foods in ancient Rome. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle in. Let the room grow quiet. And maybe keep your midnight snack simple tonight, because we're about to wander into the stranger side of Roman cuisine. We've already drifted through their banquets and spectacles. But what really set Roman dining apart wasn't just the quantity. It was the creativity. And by creativity, I mean their willingness to eat things that would make most modern stomachs curl up and file for divorce. So let's step softly into the kitchens of ancient Rome, and see what counted as exotic delicacy. The Roman love affair with unusual food began with status. For ordinary citizens, the diet was simple: bread, porridge, lentils, olives, maybe some cheese or fish if you were lucky. Filling, plain, dependable. But if you were wealthy, oh, then dinner was your chance to prove not only your fortune, but your taste, measured in rarity, strangeness, and expense. And so, the rich turned to foods that traveled hundreds of miles, or that simply sounded bizarre. Take dormice. Yes, dormice, the small, furry rodents that most of us would associate with woodland stories or a cozy nap. In Rome, they were roasted, stuffed, and served on silver platters. Farmers even raised them in special jars called gloraria, where the mice were fattened on nuts and chestnuts until they reached the perfect plumpness. Stuffed dormouse, sprinkled with honey and poppy seeds, was a genuine delicacy. Imagine reclining at a banquet, the host proudly presenting a tray of golden brown rodents. And you smiling politely, because you had to. Then there were flamingo tongues. The Romans adored birds of all kinds: peacock, parrot, pheasant, but flamingo tongues were considered the most exquisite morsel. the logic behind this choice remains mysterious. Perhaps the bright pink plumage convinced people that the tongue must be rare and valuable. Perhaps someone simply tried it once and decided it was a flex. Either way, thousands of flamingos paid the price for aristocratic snacking. Pliny the Elder, Rome's great encyclopedist, even noted that flamingo tongues had a particularly delightful flavor. Which, knowing Pliny, may or may not have been true. But in Rome, the stranger the better. Seafood was another arena for excess. Romans prized oysters above almost anything else. They built elaborate ponds and tanks to farm them, and imported them across the empire. Wealthy gourmets claimed they could taste the difference between oysters from different coasts, much like a modern wine snob distinguishing vintages. And then there was garum. Garum was Rome's favorite condiment, a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish guts, salt, and herbs in vats, leaving them to liquefy under the sun, and straining off the pungent liquid. The smell was apocalyptic. But garum was poured over nearly everything: meat, vegetables, bread. To Romans, it was both luxury and necessity. To modern noses, it was essentially anchovy juice on steroids. Factories along the Spanish and North African coasts produced garum by the barrel, shipping it in amphorae marked with stamps to advertise the quality. And of course, the richest households insisted on the most expensive, first-pressing garum, like olive oil, but made of fish sludge. Now, about those banquets. If your host really wanted to impress, he'd provide food not just from distant provinces, but in absurd forms. A goose stuffed with a chicken, stuffed with a duck, stuffed with a songbird. Whole pigs roasted and then refilled with sausages, so when they were carved open, the table seemed to birth more food. Apicius, the legendary Roman gourmand, left behind a cookbook filled with these sorts of recipes. He advised boiling ostrich with pepper and dates, or serving sow's udders, or making a dessert of pine nuts, honey, and ground pepper. Yes, pepper was sprinkled on desserts, because in Rome, pepper was both precious and a sign that you were wealthy enough to waste it. Speaking of Apicius, he's worth pausing on. Marcus Gavius Apicius was the epitome of excessive dining. He reportedly spent a fortune seeking out the rarest dishes. He sailed across the Mediterranean just to taste a batch of particularly fine shrimp. He experimented with flamingo and camel heels. His name became synonymous with luxury eating. Eventually, Apicius bankrupted himself through food. And when he realized his remaining fortune was too small to support the life of constant exotic banquets, he calmly poisoned himself. A man who lived, and died, for dinner. One of the strangest Roman food habits involved color. The rich adored novelty. So chefs used saffron, wine reductions, and even crushed minerals to dye food in unusual shades. A dish of beans might arrive bright purple. A loaf of bread, gleaming yellow. Peacocks were roasted whole, then redressed in their feathers so they looked alive again. It was theater as much as nourishment. And the guests? They were expected to praise every absurdity. To marvel at the cleverness of a host who made a pie that, when sliced open, released live birds. Or to politely nibble at jelly molded into the shape of fish, served alongside an actual fish, just because symmetry was amusing. Let's drift, for a moment, to the drinks. Wine was everywhere. But Romans rarely drank it straight, that was considered barbaric. Instead, it was diluted with water, flavored with honey, spiced with herbs, or even mixed with seawater for that briny punch. The wealthy could afford the finest vintages from Greece. Others drank sour local brews, or wine stretched so thin it was basically pinkish water. And yet, the elite still found ways to make it excessive. Some cooled their wine with imported snow, stored in underground pits. Others infused it with roses, violets, or myrrh, producing something that was halfway between a drink and a perfume. Of course, all this indulgence came with side effects. The Roman elite were notorious for vomiting mid-banquet to make room for more food. Contrary to popular myth, they didn't actually have special vomitoriums. That was a term for stadium exits, not spewing chambers. But plenty of guests did excuse themselves discreetly, then returned to the couches for another round. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, despised this. He wrote bitterly about gluttons who vomit so they may eat, and eat so they may vomit. To him, Rome's feasting culture was moral decay served on a platter. To the diners, it was just another Wednesday. What's fascinating, as we drift through these foods, is how much of Rome's exotic cuisine was about appearances. Dormice, flamingo tongues, dyed beans, they weren't about flavor. They were about proving wealth, cleverness, and control over nature. Eating rare animals showed you could command the empire's reach. Serving absurdly colored dishes showed you could bend the world to your whim. The empire stretched from Scotland to Syria. And on the dining tables of Rome, you could taste little fragments of that dominion, whether or not they were actually edible. So, as the night deepens, let's imagine it. A long table lined with reclining couches. Silver dishes gleaming in lamplight. The smell of honey, wine, and something slightly unsettling. A host beams as servants present a tray of roasted dormice. Another guest raises a cup of seawater wine, pretending to enjoy it. And somewhere in the corner, Apicius is planning his next absurd culinary conquest. Exotic foods. Outlandish tastes. Rome's empire, not just written in marble and conquest, but chewed, swallowed, and sometimes, politely spat out into a napkin. The most inbred monarchs in European history, deep dive. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's sink down into the cushions a little more. Close your eyes, if you like. And picture a royal court, not filled with glamour, but with pale, fragile faces, faces that all look strangely alike. This is where dynastic ambition met biology. Where centuries of strategic marriage meant cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and a family tree that looked less like a branching oak and more like a snake curling in on itself. Tonight, we're wandering slowly through the stories of the most inbred monarchs in European history. Let's begin with the dynasty most people think of first, the Habsburgs. For centuries, the Habsburg family ruled a patchwork empire: Austria, Spain, Hungary, parts of Italy, the Low Countries. Their motto was, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." And marry they did. But they married each other. Over and over. By the 1500s and 1600s, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs had become a case study in genetic collapse. The most famous victim? Charles II of Spain. Known to history as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, Charles was the product of generations of uncle-niece and cousin marriages. His jaw jutted so far forward that he could barely chew. His tongue was oversized, making speech difficult. He suffered seizures, digestive problems, and likely multiple genetic disorders. His autopsy described a body that seemed far older than his 38 years. And most crucially, he was sterile. His line ended with him in 1700, plunging Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. One broken man, and an entire continent thrown into chaos. But the Habsburgs weren't alone. Travel north, and we find the Danish royal family. King Christian VII of Denmark, in the 18th century, was plagued by mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. While not entirely caused by inbreeding, his family's repeated cousin marriages likely worsened his condition. Christian was so unstable that courtiers had to guide him through even basic ceremonies. His marriage collapsed, his doctor effectively ruled the kingdom, and his story became one of Europe's great royal tragedies. Then there's Maria I of Portugal, remembered as Maria the Mad. Her parents? Uncle and niece. Her husband? Her father's brother. Yes, she married her own uncle. Maria suffered crippling depression and terrifying fits of religious mania. She would shriek through the palace at night, convinced she was damned. When her favorite confessor died, she reportedly screamed until her voice gave out. Eventually, her son had to take over as regent because she was incapable of ruling. The Portuguese court, once elegant and bright, became a shadowed place filled with whispers and fear. Even England wasn't immune. Though less extreme than Spain or Portugal, the English royal family dabbled in cousin marriage often enough to weaken the pool. Henry VIII, with his string of tragic wives and stillbirths, may have carried a rare genetic condition. Some scholars suggest Kell blood group incompatibility or MacLeod syndrome. Either way, the dynasty ended after his children. And centuries later, Queen Victoria spread hemophilia across the courts of Europe through her descendants, A reminder that even a single mutation, passed down through closed dynasties, could alter history. But perhaps the saddest story of all belongs again to Spain. If Charles II was the collapse, then Philip IV, his father, was the warning sign. Philip married his niece. She was just 14, he was 44. Their children mostly died young. Only Charles survived. And we already know how that ended. Imagine being at court during this time. Every birth a cause for hope. Every funeral a quiet confirmation that something was deeply wrong. Yet no one dared suggest opening the bloodline. Tradition was stronger than biology. It's worth pausing here to think about why this kept happening. For monarchs, marriage wasn't about love. It was politics, alliances, treaties, property. And the safest political alliance was often your own family. So cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Aunts married nephews. And on parchment, it looked clever. No risk of betrayal. Land stayed in the dynasty. The bloodline remained pure. But in practice, the gene pool shrank. Mutations repeated. Disorders accumulated. And after enough generations, you got Charles II. A man who could barely rule his own body, let alone a kingdom. Let's soften the lights even further now. Picture those royal portraits, pale faces, heavy jaws, tired eyes. Painted to look regal. But behind the brushstrokes lay bodies racked with epilepsy, infertility, madness, and melancholy. Kings who could not produce heirs. Queens who wasted away in depression. Princes born weak, dying before their first birthdays. A dynasty collapsing, not by war or rebellion, but by its own obsession with itself. And yet, the cycle wasn't broken until it was too late. It took the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs, the decline of Portuguese royalty, the humiliation of countless sickly monarchs, for Europe's courts to finally learn, maybe marrying outside the family wasn't such a bad idea. By the 18th and 19th centuries, royal matchmaking began to spread out. German princes wed Russian princesses. British royals married Danes. The bloodlines widened. Slowly, the damage eased. But the stories remained. Cautionary tales, painted in oil and carved into marble. Reminders that power without wisdom can undo itself. So, as the night deepens, imagine it once more. A candlelit throne room. The air heavy with incense and expectation. A child king seated on the throne, his jaw too large, his voice too small. Courtiers bowing, whispering, pretending not to see. And the family tree behind him, curling inward like smoke. The most inbred monarchs in European history. Rulers undone, not by enemies abroad, but by the marriages within their own halls. Hey everyone. Settle in. Let your breath drift out slowly. And tonight, we're wandering back to the Roman world again. But not the feasting and gladiator games this time. No lions, no fireworks of flamingo tongues. Instead, we're following a quieter figure. A man who somehow became both emperor and philosopher. The so-called last of the good emperors. Marcus Aurelius. He was born in 121 CE, in Rome. A comfortable childhood, but not exactly dazzling. His family was wealthy and well-connected, but he wasn't in line for the throne. Not at first. What stood out was his personality. He was calm. Studious. Slightly gloomy, even as a child. He loved philosophy, especially the kind that encouraged patience, reason, and detachment. Which is not exactly the personality you'd expect for someone who would end up ruling millions of people. As a teenager, he caught the attention of Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian looked at the boy and thought, yes, this one seems useful. So Hadrian arranged a neat little dynastic puzzle, passing the empire along through a chain of adoptive heirs, which eventually landed Marcus in the role. It was adoption politics at its finest. Bloodlines mattered less than handpicking the right person. And in Marcus's case, he became heir through a series of careful adoptions that made him the son of Antoninus Pius, Hadrian's successor. So while other Roman boys were worrying about Greek poetry recitations or trying not to embarrass themselves at gladiator games, Marcus was being groomed to run the known world. When Antoninus Pius died in 161, Marcus took power. He did something unusual: he shared it. He insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, rule as co-emperor. The Romans weren't used to this. Power was usually a one-man show. But Marcus didn't want the burden alone. Perhaps he already suspected that ruling Rome would be more stress than glory. He was right. The empire during Marcus's reign was anything but peaceful. Wars on the eastern frontier. Plagues spreading across the land, probably smallpox, devastating populations. Germanic tribes pressing along the Danube. Instead of spending his days writing philosophy in quiet gardens, Marcus spent them in muddy military camps, shivering in tents, reading by lamplight while soldiers groaned outside with illness. It was a grim backdrop for a philosopher. But it also gave us his most famous work, the Meditations. Now, the Meditations weren't written for anyone else. They were Marcus's private notes. A kind of self-therapy. Little reminders to stay calm, to endure, to accept what fate threw his way. Don't waste time worrying about other people's opinions. Remember, you will die, so don't cling too tightly to trivial things. That sort of thing. They weren't meant as a book. And yet, centuries later, they've become a bestseller. Which is funny, because Marcus himself probably would have rolled his eyes at the idea of people romanticizing his notes. Of course, being philosophical didn't make him immune to dysfunction. For one thing, he married Faustina the Younger, his cousin. Naturally. Rome couldn't resist keeping things in the family. They had a lot of children. At least 13. Most of them died young, which was tragically normal for the time. But one survived to adulthood. His name was Commodus. Yes, that Commodus. The emperor who fancied himself a gladiator. The spoiled, violent man who undid much of his father's careful work. And this is where Marcus's life story takes a turn. For all his stoic wisdom, for all his calm reasoning, his greatest mistake was leaving the empire to his son. He could have chosen adoption again, like Hadrian and Antoninus had done. But Marcus broke tradition. He let biology win. The result? Commodus became emperor. And Rome lurched into chaos. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Marcus himself ruled for nearly 2 decades. He faced one crisis after another. He often seemed weary, worn down, more monk than monarch. Ancient writers sometimes mocked him for being too gentle, too thoughtful. But the truth is, he probably kept the empire together longer than anyone else could have. He died in 180 CE, during yet another campaign along the Danube frontier. His body was carried back to Rome, and his ashes placed in Hadrian's mausoleum. And with him, many say, the golden age of the empire ended. It's a quiet, ironic ending. The philosopher king who wrote about the fleeting nature of life, about the inevitability of death, about accepting fate, died tired, in a border camp, surrounded not by marble and ceremony, but by coughing soldiers and the smell of damp leather. And he left his empire to a son who would unravel it. If you picture him now, don't think of him in a laurel crown. Picture him hunched over a wax tablet, scribbling down another note to himself. Stay calm. Don't let anger guide you. Life is short. Accept what you cannot change. Notes not written for us. But somehow, across nearly 2,000 years, still whispering to us. In the voice of a weary man, who wanted nothing more than peace, and was given the empire instead. The strange reign of Commodus, 161 to 192 CE. Hey everyone. Take another slow breath. Let your shoulders soften. And tonight, we're continuing straight from where we left off. From the quiet wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, to the noisy chaos of his son, Commodus. Commodus was born in 161 CE. And from the start, he was wrapped in silk and ceremony. He was Marcus Aurelius's only surviving son, the little heir to the world. By the time he was a teenager, he was already emperor in name, co-ruler with his father. While Marcus was writing stoic meditations in the mud of a frontier camp, Commodus was back in Rome, basking in luxury. It was a recipe for trouble. because Commodus was not his father's son, at least in temperament. Where Marcus was serious, Commodus was frivolous. Where Marcus sought wisdom, Commodus sought attention. And where Marcus accepted hardship, Commodus wanted comfort, preferably on a golden couch, with grapes. When Marcus died in 180 CE, Commodus inherited the empire outright. He was only 18. Young, handsome, healthy. The people hoped he'd continue his father's legacy. Instead, he became, well, Commodus. His reign was long on spectacle, short on substance. Let's start with his favorite pastime, the arena. Commodus loved to fight as a gladiator. Yes. The Emperor of Rome, ruler of millions, decided that nothing was more dignified than strapping on armor, sweating under the sun, and pretending to be Hercules reborn. Now, he didn't actually risk much. His opponents were usually terrified gladiators with blunted weapons, or wounded soldiers who had no choice but to lose. Commodus strutted around, waving his sword, and then claimed victory after victory. The people weren't fooled. They laughed behind their hands. The emperor looked ridiculous, parading in lion skins, wielding a club, insisting he was the living Hercules. But of course, you couldn't say that. Not unless you wanted to disappear quietly one night. So the Senate clapped politely. Courtiers painted him as a god. And Commodus kept fighting, over 700 staged bouts, all carefully arranged so the emperor came out on top. He also developed a fondness for renaming things. At one point, he tried to rename the months of the year after himself. He renamed Rome itself the Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. It was the sort of megalomania that sounds silly now, but at the time, it meant endless chiseling on official inscriptions, endless groveling from officials trying to keep up with his vanity. Meanwhile, actual governance suffered. Commodus wasn't interested in tax reform or frontier defense. He left the administration of the empire to his favorites, powerful freedmen, ambitious senators, and eventually his mistress, Marcia. Corruption spread like mold. Provinces groaned under mismanagement. The Senate hated him. The army tolerated him only because he kept paying them. And yet, for the average Roman citizen, Commodus was entertaining. He gave them shows. Grain. Festivals. A constant distraction from the empire's decline. Bread and circuses at full volume. But dysfunction has a way of catching up. Commodus grew increasingly paranoid. He executed senators on flimsy suspicions. He staged elaborate purges. At one point, he killed off his closest advisors and replaced them with flatterers who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Even his gladiatorial shows grew darker. He would slaughter animals in the arena, not in contests of skill, but by simply shooting arrows at them from a safe distance. Ostriches, elephants, even a giraffe once fell to his hunting prowess. The crowds clapped nervously, wondering what fresh absurdity would follow. Eventually, the palace itself turned against him. In 192 CE, on New Year's Eve, Commodus prepared to enter the arena again, this time dressed as a gladiator for a grand festival. He intended to begin the new year not as emperor, but as Hercules incarnate, gladiator and god. That was one humiliation too many for the Senate and his inner circle. His mistress Marcia, along with conspirators in the Praetorian Guard, decided enough was enough. They poisoned his wine. When that didn't work quickly enough, a wrestler named Narcissus strangled him in his bath. The emperor who loved the arena died in the most private, unglamorous way possible. No crowd, no applause. Just a few servants watching him slip beneath the water. Commodus's death was greeted with relief. The Senate declared him a public enemy. His statues were toppled. His memory damned. But the damage was done. With his assassination, Rome slid into a new crisis, the so-called Year of the Five Emperors, when generals and politicians scrambled for power. In many ways, Commodus marked the end of Rome's golden age. His father had been the last of the good emperors. Commodus was the first of many who dragged the empire into decline. And yet, if you look at his reign from a sleepy distance, it feels oddly human. Here was a young man, born into impossible power, handed the empire of the world before he had even grown up. And what did he do? He played. He sought applause. He chased vanity. Not wisdom, not stability, but the roar of a crowd. It's a story as old as power itself. So, as we let his memory fade, picture the Colosseum again. But this time, instead of professional gladiators, a pampered emperor, swinging a sword against opponents too terrified to strike back. Sweat dripping. Crowds forced to cheer. Senators hiding smirks behind their togas. Commodus, Rome's strangest emperor. Not remembered for laws or victories, but for treating the empire like his personal circus. And perhaps, in the end, that's all he ever wanted. The year of the 5 emperors, 193 CE. Hey everyone. Take another breath. Let your thoughts unclench. And tonight, we're slipping into one of Rome's strangest years. The year after Commodus. The year the empire couldn't quite decide who was in charge. The year of 5 emperors. It began, as we know, with Commodus strangled in his bath. The Senate rejoiced. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's supposed protectors, shrugged and waited for the next paycheck. The city woke up on New Year's Day, 193 CE, wondering who exactly was emperor. The answer came quickly: Pertinax. Pertinax was an elderly senator, around 66 years old. He had a decent reputation. He was honest, hard-working, more of a teacher than a tyrant. In fact, he'd been a schoolmaster in his youth, hardly the typical resume for running Rome. The Senate proclaimed him emperor. The Praetorian Guard, slightly grumpy but still cooperative, went along. Pertinax tried to restore order. He cut back on spending, tried to clean up corruption, tried to behave a little like Marcus Aurelius had. But of course, this didn't go well. Because the Praetorian Guard had grown used to bribes, bonuses, and luxury under Commodus. Pertinax wasn't generous enough. He scolded them, tried to discipline them. And within 3 months, they marched into the palace and cut him down. The philosopher emperor's son had lasted 12 years. Pertinax? 86 days. And then came the most farcical moment of all. With Pertinax dead, the Praetorians did what any respectable imperial guard would never do: they auctioned off the empire. Yes, quite literally. They invited wealthy senators to bid for the throne, like a prize at a market stall. The winner was Didius Julianus, who promised a massive donative, millions of sesterces, to the guards. He outbid his rivals and strolled into the palace as emperor. It was corruption laid bare. Everyone knew it. The people despised him. The Senate squirmed. And in the provinces, governors began sharpening their swords. Because the empire wasn't just Rome. It stretched from Britain to Syria. And generals on those frontiers had their own ambitions. In Britain, Clodius Albinus gathered his forces. In Syria, Pescennius Niger rallied support. And in the Danube provinces, Septimius Severus, commander of the legions, began marching toward Rome. Julianus, the auction winner, panicked. He tried to negotiate. He begged the Senate for support. But the legions of the empire had made their choice: Severus. When Severus approached the capital, the Senate switched allegiance instantly. Julianus was executed in the palace he had bought like a second-hand sofa. His reign had lasted 66 days. Now Severus was emperor. He was a soldier's emperor. Stern, practical, ruthless. But the year wasn't done yet. Because both Niger and Albinus still claimed the throne. Severus marched east to face Niger. The battles were long and brutal. Cities in Asia Minor were besieged, civilians slaughtered, fields burned. By 194 CE, Niger was dead, his head displayed as a warning. Then Severus turned west, toward Gaul, where Albinus had declared himself Augustus. Another bloody campaign followed. In 197, Albinus's forces were crushed near Lyon. He took his own life, and Severus had his body desecrated in public. And so, by the end of this violent shuffle, only one man stood: Septimius Severus. The year of 5 emperors had produced rivers of blood, a ruined capital, and a shaken senate. But it had also birthed a new dynasty, the Severans, who would rule Rome for the next few decades. Looking back, it all feels strangely dreamlike. Pertinax, the well-meaning schoolteacher emperor, gone in a flash. Julianus, the emperor bought at auction, gone even faster. Niger, Albinus, Severus, all carving their names into history with steel. 5 emperors in 1 year. 5 faces on coins. 5 different sets of statues hurriedly carved, then just as hurriedly toppled. And behind it all, the Praetorian Guard counting their bribes, the Senate clapping nervously, and the Roman people watching the circus, hoping, just hoping, that the next emperor might actually last. It's a reminder, whispered across time, that even the grandest empire can fall into farce. That sometimes the throne of the world is not a marble pedestal of glory, but a chair for sale to the highest bidder. And that in 193 CE, Rome wasn't ruled by vision or virtue, but by whoever survived long enough to sit down. The Severan dynasty, power, scandal, and collapse. Hello again, and welcome back. Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. And settle in for tonight's story. We're floating into the Severan age now, beginning in the year 193 CE. After the storm of 5 emperors. At the center of it all was Septimius Severus. He had marched on Rome with his Danubian legions, swept aside rivals, and claimed the purple. A soldier through and through, Severus was not graceful, nor charming, nor especially loved by the Senate. But he was firm, ruthless. The kind of man who could glue a fractured empire back together, even if he had to do it with blood. He strengthened the army, increased their pay, expanded their privileges. He made it clear, the legions were the true power of Rome now, not the Senate, not the people, and certainly not the Praetorian Guard. The philosopher emperors were gone. This was the age of soldiers. Severus also had a family. A wife named Julia Domna, from the city of Emesa in Syria. She was clever, cultured, and politically shrewd. In many ways, she was more stateswoman than empress, and she became a stabilizing presence in the palace. Together, they had 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. And if you think that sounds like a recipe for harmony, well, it wasn't. Severus ruled until 211 CE. On his deathbed, in York, Britain, he gave his sons advice that history would remember. Get along. Enrich the soldiers. And ignore everyone else. It was half practical, half hopeless. Because Caracalla and Geta loathed each other. They returned to Rome as joint emperors, but their reign was less partnership and more permanent civil war in miniature. They divided the palace down the middle. Separate entrances, separate guards, separate servants. Meetings in between them were conducted with their mothers standing in the middle, a physical barrier to stop them from lunging at each other. Finally, in late 211, Caracalla made his move. During a supposed peace meeting, Geta was murdered in his mother's arms. Blood soaked her dress. Caracalla now ruled alone. Caracalla's reign was brutal. He massacred Geta's supporters. Thousands were killed in purges. He introduced the Constitutio Antoniniana, a sweeping decree granting Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, not out of generosity, but because it widened the tax base. He also adored the army, showering them with money. But he had a cruel streak. Tales spread of him slaughtering whole groups of civilians over petty slights. His greatest project was the baths of Caracalla in Rome, vast, monumental, and luxurious. They still stand today, ruins of grandeur. But he did not last long. In 217, while campaigning in the east, Caracalla was assassinated by one of his own soldiers. The dynasty faltered. Next came Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who had arranged the killing. But Macrinus wasn't of noble blood. And the Severan women weren't done yet. Julia Domna had died, but her sister, Julia Misa, was determined to restore the family's power. She put forward her teenage grandson, a flamboyant priest of the sun god Elagabalus, known to us as Elagabalus. Elagabalus's reign, 218 to 222 CE, is one of the strangest in Roman history. Barely 14 when he took the throne, He shocked conservative Rome with religious reforms, bizarre rituals, and a taste for scandal. He promoted the worship of his Syrian god above Jupiter. He paraded through the streets in silk, jewels, and makeup. Ancient sources, gleefully hostile, describe him as decadent, erratic, and unfit for rule. Whether truth or exaggeration, one thing is clear: the army lost patience. By 222, Elagabalus and his mother were murdered by the Praetorian Guard, their bodies dragged through the streets and dumped into the Tiber. The next, and last, Severan ruler was Severus Alexander, another grandson of Julia Maesa. Younger, calmer, more traditional. He ruled from 222 to 235 CE, a rare stretch of stability after years of chaos. His mother, Julia Mamaea, guided him closely, and for a time it seemed Rome had a gentle, moderate hand on the throne again. But the empire was changing. Enemies pressed harder on the frontiers. The army grew restless. In 235, when Alexander tried to negotiate peace with invading Germanic tribes instead of fighting, the legions mutinied. He and his mother were killed in their tent. And with that, the Severan dynasty ended. What followed was worse. The crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of near-constant upheaval, usurpers, invasions, plagues, and economic collapse. But that's a tale for another night. So, the Severans. A family that began with a soldier in Britain, and ended with a boy emperor slain by his own men. They held power through steel, blood, and the cunning of women like Julia Domna and Julia Maesa. They left behind monuments, scandals, and rivers of stories. But in the end, their dynasty was only a flicker. A brief flame before the long storm.